Welcome, everyone. This is the Digital Culture Ideas Show and Podcast, and it's the show that helps you understand the biggest cultural shift that's happening right now, which is a move towards a more digital culture. So technology and the internet is massively changing the way we behave, think, interact, and communicate. And today, I am thrilled to be speaking to James Stewart, Director of Gemelli Consulting, about his work leading social enterprises and the impact that technology is having to tackle social and environmental problems. So James has a real passion for seeing change through our society. And as the Director of Gemelli Consulting, James provides project finance and commercial strategy advice to social enterprises and not-for-profits. And he's really trying to help them unlock opportunities which they can then have a further impact on our world. So James holds and has held a number of board roles as well, including the Christchurch YMCA, Soul Capital, the Christchurch Adventure Park, which is where my kids are going on holiday camp tomorrow, and then also the Christchurch City Island Church. So welcome, James. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, Hilary. Great to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. Look, I'm seeing this really clear theme in your background and your experience around really wanting to align yourself with, wanting to make a positive impact and be socially responsible. That's coming through loud and clear. So can you tell our listeners why that is, and maybe a bit about your origin story for context as well?
Sure thing. So I went through Canterbury University with a BCom and really had great sort of aspirations of the white picket fence, the corner office, building an empire, accumulating wealth and using my financial and commercial brain for me and to build up on my empire, as it were. And a couple of key mentors and peers in my early 20s really helped me unpack, identifying my sense of privilege and realizing that, for nothing but a roll of the dice, I ended up being born into Christchurch, into white middle class society. And if the dice had rolled another way, I could have been born into a village in Tanzania. And that was a real wake-up call for me, I think, during that time, thinking that even though I was middle class in society, I wasn't middle class globally. And that was a real epiphany for me, saying and starting to think about, okay, how am I going to use this privilege? I've been able to have been brought up in a great culture, have access to top quality education and a great network of people. Am I going to use those things in order to get rich and have all the toys? Or am I going to help use those things to help level the playing field, as it were? So I sort of asked myself, if I had another roll of the dice and it ends up being born in a Tanzanian village, what would that person have wanted from me with all this amazing opportunity to help? So that led to a couple of really neat career opportunities. I was good with numbers, I had a commercial mind. So that opened up fantastic opportunities with a firm called Ridgeway Capital Projects, who provided infrastructure project advisory services to developing countries and development banks. So started to use a commercial skill set to help bring good infrastructure to developing countries in a financially sustainable way. That led on to some of the earthquake rebuild work on the infrastructure side. And then 3 years ago, I founded Gemelli Consulting. So a group of project managers, financial analysts that help, like you said, help social enterprises and not-for-profits make good investment decisions in what they do.
Wow, James, I actually really love that you recognise the white privilege piece, because that's something I've been fortunate as well. I've had good education and things like that, and it shouldn't be taken for granted. I also love that you're flipping it around to kind of set things right in some ways as well. I also think you've underplayed some of the work that you have done, particularly around the Christchurch rebuild and things like that. Some really excellent work that you've done there, and thank you very much for that. And I'm sure in getting to the point where you've got your own consulting company, there's probably been some trials and tribulations along the way. Nothing's ever straightforward, is it? It'd be great if you could perhaps share some of those that have really helped you achieve your goals and impact.
Yeah, it's been a fantastic 3 years since we've been pushing Gemelli. We've grown a great team. We've got phenomenal clients. But I think it's probably the nature of the sectors that we work in that really create the trials and tribulations. You know, a lot of the work that we're doing around impact investment and social return on investment, those sorts of concepts, they are relatively new, both globally but specifically for New Zealand. And so that's probably where our trials and tribulations have really come from, is that we've chosen an area that's not standard, it doesn't have a BAU, it is really still in that emerging phase. And so the rest of the market might be interested in it, but because, you know, in very blunt terms, because impact investment is a relatively new concept, because assessing impact and outcomes through social return on investment, those sorts of things, is also new in most people's minds, and understandably so. New means risk, and risk typically means slower as a result, as people walk their way through and get greater levels of assurance. So that's probably been our frustration and our challenge, is that the ideas that we have, the teams that we're working on, the part of the sector that we're working in, it does take a while to take others on the journey in that space there and look at innovative housing solutions and financing solutions for property and affordable housing. How do we measure impact on those softer, non-financial outcomes and give people confidence that they're investing to unlock those? So it definitely has been slower than we would have liked, but we're definitely also seeing great momentum in those sectors as well. And hopefully that's the start of that exponential growth, and hopefully, you know, if we're taking an intergenerational approach, hopefully we're carving a wee bit of a path that makes it a bit easier for those that are following in our footsteps.
Absolutely. And actually that's kind of the next area I'd like to move on to chat to you about, is that sort of leadership and governance area. You talked about having to take people on the journey and influence in that space, and how slow that can be. What has that perhaps taught you about leadership that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because I never set out for Gemelli to be, you know, an organisation or a company, and admittedly we're still very much in our infancy, and are moving towards where we want to go, and we're definitely not there yet. But didn't come out with a real drive or an expectation to build a team and to grow an organisation. It was, at the start, it was just me and saying, right, I've finished one season, I'm going to start something new. But the work seemed to grow, the clients seemed to accumulate, and we built a little team as a result. And so I'm well aware that there's 1,000 different leadership styles, and there's 1,000 different areas that they're appropriate in and less appropriate in, depending on sectors and times and scale. But for me and my journey, both with Gemelli, but through organisations prior as well, I think probably there's three things that really stand out for me. The first is keeping it real. I don't think people like leaders putting on a show and a performance and painting a rosy picture or being overly, you know, dominant or anything like that. I think people respect realness, and teams respond really well to people that aren't putting on a facade. That they know that you're a human as well as, you know, the owner of a company or the leader of a team. So that's a delicate balance, of course, you know, the right amount of humanness to bring forward, because you've also got to be their leader and their boss in tough times. But
so what
I think
like when you are being human, like as a leader, what does that look like? Can you give us an example?
I think it's genuinely celebrating the good things and being grateful for those things that come through. I think it's being professionally appropriate in disappointment when things don't go the team's way or the sector's way, and I think it's developing that right balance of being both a boss and a friend or a colleague as well. So having that balance between, you know, social settings and professional settings as well, and that's a real delicate balance. It's a real art, I suppose, to get, and I don't think any one of us in our leadership journeys got that right the first time. The pendulum might swing back and forth slightly if we're being honest with ourselves. But I think over time, it's just figuring out when's the appropriate time to share, what are the appropriate things to share about what's going on in your own world. Because I think especially with millennials and the like coming through, they want a deeper connection with what they're doing and with the people that they're doing it with. So that's probably the first key piece is keeping it real. The second piece around leadership, I think, is as a group is finding your niche and delivering on that. I think that's really important that we get the right team members in the right roles and working, really well with their skill sets. I don't think that means that every team member is going to love every single thing that they're doing, every single hour of the week. But I think finding and identifying and seeing potential in people, especially with younger team members coming up, is seeing the potential in them when quite often they can't see it themselves. Maybe people coming back to work after a season off and maybe a bit of confidence lacking, giving that encouragement that actually they can do so much more than they may believe they can. So I think it's getting the right people in the right role. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's really making sure people are working in the right zone.
Yes.
And then the third thing, without jumping into Simon Sinek too much, is to me, I think leadership is keeping the why of your organisation at the centre of what you do. So I think that's incredibly powerful. So Gemelli, as a social enterprise, 100% of our profit goes towards building homes in Nepal through Habitat for Humanity and helping feed 100 kids at a local school in Christchurch that wouldn't be fed either. So it's really easy for us to focus on, billable hours and churning projects through and making sure clients are happy. But for us, it's also about at each team meeting and when we write a proposal and we do a closeout lessons learned report, is looking at what's the impact of what we're trying to achieve and how many homes in Nepal do we build with the margin from our project and how many kids could we feed and always bringing it back to that centerpiece. So every organisation is going to have its own why, every team member is going to have their own why. But it's really easy to listen to a podcast and get inspired about your why, but then not think about it for 6 months or 6 weeks. So I think deliberately leading your team by keeping that at the fore is something that I've found incredibly helpful to keeping morale up and keeping you focused.
James, I love that because actually that's really practicing what you're preaching as well, because what you're talking about is impact on society, and then that's exactly what is part of your a big part of the organization's mission as well. And I think you're right in terms of getting to know the individuals in your team and the strengths that they have. I was recently inspired by a colleague who's a new manager, new sort of team leader, and they really wanted to get to know everyone in their team. So they found these really good questions that they were going to ask around what people liked doing and in which contexts and what they didn't like doing, and came up with this whole list. And I was like, that's actually awesome. Like sometimes as a leader, while that might sound prescriptive, sometimes as a leader, you forget that there's some really just basic good practice that you can put into place that really kind of your team going and helps you understand your team members so much more.
And I think you're right. That's part of the fun, isn't it? You're working with people, you get to know them. Just before Christmas, we did it's called a Bead and Proceed workshop. And so you're working through the sustainable development goals and finding out which ones of those are the most poignant, the most driven for each person in your team, and finding out where they naturally gravitate to. Is it around education or inequality or an environment? So we did that as a team, as a way of finding out, a bit more about each other. So I really love that concept of taking the time to invest in understanding your team a bit more.
Absolutely. What a cool exercise. Yeah. And so actually that sort of brings me to my next question. Is leading like an organization or a team that's focused on social enterprises different from leading other sorts of teams in businesses in your experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think it's almost a yes and no answer, because I think at the end of the day, no matter what sector you're in and the nature of the company, people are still people and projects are still projects, right? So there's a general baseline of leadership, which I think is entirely consistent. Yes. I think probably the main difference that I've found with Gemelli being a deliberate social enterprise has been it's almost a filter, because you don't tend to get too many egotistical people coming and wanting to work for a social enterprise. It's almost a filter where you do get people that have potentially been following you and keeping an eye through LinkedIn and other forms for a while. And then when you do talk about an opening in your team, you've almost got this pre-formed group of people that are more aligned ethically, morally, to what you're trying to achieve.
Yes.
And it's not to say that those people don't exist in every other team, because of course they do, but that's probably the one thing that I found, is that you don't get too many purely capitalist people working in social enterprises. You do have people that are focused on doing good as well. So I think it's those people with a stronger sense of professional purpose. It's easier for them to link into their why and to incorporate that into their 9 to 5. It's probably easier to unify a team and therefore lead a team and motivate them as a result.
Oh, that's really interesting. That makes sense. And so now, actually, I'd like to talk more specifically about digital culture and the social enterprise work you have done. In your pursuit of making the world a better place, you've done some pretty outstanding things. For example, you've mentioned the houses you built in Nepal, and I'm just going to pause for emphasis around that one. You've assisted with the infrastructure development in Christchurch post-earthquakes, and through the work of Soul Capital, you also look at the lack of investment in capital available to entrepreneurs and enterprises who are tackling those really difficult society and environmental problems. I've kind of got two things here. First is, do you want to bring alive some of that great work for me so that people can really understand what that's about? And then the second part is, I'm wondering whether or not there's an impact that technology and the internet has had that's changing what you're doing in that space and the impact you're having.
Yeah, no, another really great question. And it has been great, over the last, 10, 20 years to see that role of tech and how the digital culture has been growing and becoming more mainstream. How tools are so much more accessible that, instead of having to, I was thinking back to one of my first jobs and a piece of kit that we had to develop ourselves. We probably, as a company, tipped in $100,000. You can buy that app for $4.99 a month now, and so it's the sorts of tools are just so much more accessible, so much wider. So I think that not open sourcing, but that availability of tech is just so exciting for small businesses, for all businesses. So I think to go back a wee bit, I think, and this, I definitely wasn't the tech involved in the tech heavy piece, but in the infrastructure rebuild post-earthquake, we were on the government assurance side of things. So we were there to make sure that the government was getting value for money. And the amazing work that the Stewart team did, phenomenal investment in tech to make sure that the program was on time, on budget, that the outcomes of the program were being delivered with regards to water quality and leaks, service provision, those sorts of things. So the Stewart team were incredible with the access to tech they had from a management of the program perspective, but also the tech that was available to go into the infrastructure. And there's some amazing stuff that the Sensing Cities team have done with, tracking in the water and what that means for what's happening upstream. And some of that's come out through COVID and tracking, incidences through waste analysis and things like that. So that sort of digital piece, I think, is really, really interesting. In the Soul Capital and the impact investment piece, I think what tech and digital culture has done is it's made the world just so much smaller, and that's made raising capital a lot easier because you're able to sell an investment proposition to a far wider audience through standard platforms, through good comms, but also through capital raising platforms, crowdfunding platforms like Pledge Me and such. It's so much easier to get your vision out and provide people with the opportunity to invest in all projects, whether impact-based projects or not. So I think those are sort of two areas where our work has been exposed to tech. I think probably the other two that come up for us, as everyone well knows about lockdowns, is that I just can't imagine how we would have run our business 20, 30 years ago in a lockdown without being able to communicate with our teams and our clients, share data, share documents, track time, invoice, all of those things that we just take for granted. We literally, our entire company runs on G Suite and Xero and Pipedrive are probably our 3 tools that we use to drive our organisation. So, this laptop could catch fire this afternoon. Everything's backed up to the cloud. I could whip down to Harvey Norman, buy a new one, and we'd be up and running in 2 hours, I think. So it's that ability to work remotely and to be far more nimble through the use of tech is just phenomenal. I think the last one on there is an area that's really starting to emerge, and that's around the assurance piece and the monitoring and reporting of investment, whether they're social investments, environmental investments, or just traditional single bottom line investments. There's so much more data out there that we can evaluate and analyse to justify investment decisions, but also to confirm them once they have been made. And we can go back and we can track whether the social outcomes or the environmental or the financial outcomes are being delivered. So that access to big data in very loose terms is just amazing to provide assurance to investors that their investment is a sound one and that they should keep repeating that investment cycle.
Yeah, exactly. That it is actually having an impact and it's got the data behind it to prove it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. There has been this big global change that we've all been going through, and it kind of continues, really. But how have you used this time to perhaps create new opportunities?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, COVID's definitely changed our world in some ways, and then it hasn't changed it at all from a Gemelli perspective.
Yes.
I think probably one of the general themes is that, and I could be absolutely making this up, it's entirely anecdotal, but what we've generally noticed is that people are more aware of impact than they were 12 months ago. I think a great global pandemic is unsettling. People are focusing more on their own time, their families, their level of wellness, the impact, the level of difference that they're making on this world, as opposed to just building an empire. And it's not a binomial discussion. I think it's just swinging the pendulum to a place of just going, actually, my impact over the world is far smaller than I thought. A global pandemic can change everything. What am I going to do to try and make the world a bit of a better place? People seem to be having a greater sense of meaning, a greater sense of purpose, and valuing those non-financial things a bit more. So that's definitely created more opportunity as people look to unlock impact with their investment. Probably the downside, I don't often drop to the negative, but plummeting costs of capital have boosted up house prices and have seen a greater divide between the have and have not. So it's an opportunity we wish we didn't have. Post-COVID is more people being left off the housing ladder, but there's some amazing work underway with some incredible players in the sector to help people get into warm, dry, safe, affordable housing that we're just honoured to be partnering with them on.
Oh, exciting. Very exciting. And I don't know if you can allude to that or not, but what's your plans for the next 12 months? What are you focusing on?
Yeah, I think touching on that piece there, that the housing space, we're so fortunate to work with some amazing, lenders, brokers, developers that are focusing on this space. So housing will continue to be a really important part of where we try and unlock value. But I think from a corporate perspective, we saw 50% growth over last year. And so this year's just a solidification year for us, just going, right, growth is great, but it does put pressure on culture and processes. So from a business corporate perspective, I'm very happy just to solidify and maintain what we're unlocking in 2021.
Fair enough. And so what's your website, James? Where can people find more information about you? Where's the best place to look? And the amazing what your company does.
Yeah, so gemelliconsulting.com outlines, pretty clearly our why and who we work with and what services we offer in that space there. Jump on LinkedIn, reach out on LinkedIn. We get around the country a fair bit, so more than happy to grab a coffee or a glass of wine if people are interested in talking further.
Actually, that's something I really loved. When I reached out to you on LinkedIn, you instantly, asked for my phone number and we had a chat about it. Like that just really showed a real personal touch. So it was, really nice to be so warmly welcomed like that. So I definitely implore any listeners who want to reach out to James to do the same. I'm sure you'll get the same response. So as we're kind of finishing up, James, have you got a call to action for our community?
Yeah, I think it's just reflecting on what's changed over the last 12 months, and just I'd encourage people to really focus on impact, focus on doing good, and try and keep something bigger than yourself at the centre.
That's an awesome message. Thank you. Well, huge thanks for coming on the show today. It's really been quite inspirational to hear about the work you do in social enterprise and not-for-profits, and how you really tried to re-engineer yourself so that you could actually give back more to society. And then also the impact of digital and the areas of work that you're working in as well. So all the best, James.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Hilary.